Hello everybody, welcome again to Ready Set Test. And today's video, in my opinion, is something that I have collected over the last month and a half. As you know, I have recently started doing FPV flights, and most of my FPV gear, including this mini Talon, which as you can see is fairly beat up in here, my video system and my RC system, there are review videos on that on my channel. You might have already seen them. But this video is more focusing on the FPV itself. Now, I started FPV about a month and a half ago. To date, I probably have about 10 to 12 FPV flights. That's full battery length flights. And I have learned quite a few things. And as you can see, I have been through quite a bit. And I will touch this one later. This video is going to be medium to long-ish video. I don't want to make too many on the same subject, so I will just delve it into 4 different categories. I guess what I want to do in this video is to draw your attention towards starting out in FPV and the things that you need to be mindful of, because we can very easily forget them. I'm an experienced RC airplane flyer or pilot, whatever you want to call it. I've flown for quite a few years. You know, I'm very comfortable with flying airplanes, doing stunts and everything in the air. And I think I went into FPV thinking of that, but it was quite different, and it even took me by surprise. And that's the reason why I want to do this video, because I want you to be mindful of a few things before you go into FPV. It doesn't matter how experienced a pilot you are. And that's why I have the craft or the aeroplane right in front of me, and this is what we are going to start on. Remember, before I go ahead, I am flying 5.8 GHz video system, but I think the video system is not important. Doesn't matter what video system are you flying. The important thing is it's the main things that you have to keep in mind before you do your first FPV flight, and then keep them in mind for your next 5 to 10 flights. In a way, it's almost like starting flying all over again. I mean, I definitely had that feeling. So with that in mind, let's just go into this quickly, and I'm going to break it down into simple size bullet points. I'm not going to go on too much about them because everybody who's watching this video already knows how to fly. So we're just talking about the FPV aspect. So to start with, number 1, aeroplane. So of course, the airplane is the most important part of the FPV, goes without saying. And these days there's a huge market of airplanes that are made specifically for FPV. Namely, if I can show you, this mini UAV Talon, which for all intents and purposes is bespoke for FPV. And I kind of fell into that. I went ahead and bought that. There's a video of me unboxing it as well. Nothing wrong with the plane. But I think I forgot the things that I needed to do with it, which now I'm going to bullet point in here. The first thing for an aeroplane, I think, is ease and familiarity. What I did, in my opinion, was wrong. I shouldn't have gone and bought a completely new aeroplane, a completely new airframe, built it and flown it FPV, because that's wrong. So number 1, a plane that is familiar to you. We all have airplanes laying about, and there's always that one that flies very well, does everything we ask of it, crashes. Well, if we crash it, it gets repaired. It's just one of those planes. I'm almost the donkey of the fleet. If any which way possible, take the donkey of the fleet for your first flight. Second point, forgiveness. It has to be forgiving. The airplane has to be forgiving. The mini Talon is not a forgiving plane. Let me say this straight away. It flies fast. It has a very high stall speed, and that's the reason why this happened. So you don't want an airplane that is a challenge in itself to fly while you're already tackling a facet of FPV into it. So you want something that is very forgiving. You want something that can stall and literally just float out. You want something that turns gently, doesn't just drop out on you, and it's, you know, you can fly it almost with your hands off the radio. You should never do that, but you know the analogy. That's what you want. And number 3, efficient. Obviously, you want something that is efficient. You want an airplane that already is not starving for energy, that is already not running out of puff, that has got space in the battery and in the power plant to power your camera and your video transmitter. Because when you are flying FPV, you're adding a certain amount of more pressure onto the aeroplane's power system, which is video transmitter and camera, and that's being minimalistic. That's before you put anything else on it. So you want something that is efficient off the bat. That's the aeroplane done with. So with my rather poor experience that I had with this Mini Talon, I went ahead and picked up something that I've always been a big fan of. Here it is. Let me pull this backwards. This is the Flight Test Versa, the blunt nose version. Very easy to make. I made it myself, cost me absolutely peanuts. And as you can see, there's your video transmitter. And this I found to be one of the most forgiving planes I've ever built. And it has been with me for a very, very long time. Not this one, but another one. And I took this for FPV, and it was a completely different experience in flight. So it goes to say that you can spend some money and buy something like this, but there's no beating the familiar experience of an aeroplane that you know and that you love. Number 2 on the list of things is area, where you will be flying. It's very important. Now, I don't want to give you a public service announcement in safety of flying planes and flying FPV. That subject has already been covered for. But within the facet of that subject lies the key to your own success with FPV. Because the whole safety aspect aside, you need these things to be able to fly your FPV. And the first thing, as you can see, is familiarity. You want to fly in an area that you roughly know about. On land, you know about it. Imagine a place where you can stand and you can point into your 4 directions and know roughly how far it extends and where it extends to in the next half a kilometer. It's almost like an area awareness. If you live in an area, or if you fly in a park, or if you fly in a club, you will know exactly what I'm talking about, and you will know exactly what that familiarity in 4 directions will be for you. So it's very important to know that having your FPV flight in an area that you've never been to before, probably a very, very bad idea. I would suggest against that. Number 2, landmarks. Now that's very important. Once you're 100 to 200 feet up in the air, things look very different. Even when you're in a familiar area, things look very different from up in the air. So it's almost very important to know what landmarks you have around you. That lonely, odd tree, the line of a few trees on one side, an industrial estate or some buildings in the distance, or a road in the distance. Basically what you want to do is you want to roughly have an idea of 4 landmarks in your 4 directions, which are almost equal distance in 4 directions from you. I'm not saying that you have to find the exact center spot and stand on it, but it helps to know 4 things in all your 4 directions. That way, when you're up in the air, you can start making turns with every single landmark. In that way, you're almost roughly circling yourself, or you're flying within an envelope. You're almost making a geofence, but it's not a GPS one, it's something you're doing yourself. Number 3, population. I don't think I need to say anything else about this. You know, doing your first FPV flight in a park fully loaded in people, you're just asking for it. So that's why I put a double exclamation mark in front of this. That is stupidity. Stay away from it. And number 4, wide open. Duh, some of you would say, well, we already knew that. Yes, that is true. But by wide open, I mean a kind of area where there's not a lot of trees, not a lot of natural obstructions. A very, very rural and natural area can be not very wide open, depending on the amount of trees and the amount of hills and the amount of terrain and gradient change that you have. And that's something that can give you a problem. So what you want is not just an area which is out there and rural, also a kind of area which is slightly wide open. In one distance, you can see on a clear day, if you look in one direction, you can look as far as your eyes can see without any trees or anything blocking you. That helps, especially with your video frequency and your RF frequency, but also it helps for you to see your home position and come back to yourself. Next on the list, as I have put it, is flight envelope. You've done everything that you needed. You got yourself a familiar, forgiving aeroplane. Now you're up in the air. And as I said, things will look slightly different up in the air. So what do you do when you're into your flight envelope? Again, the things that I'm saying, they are not, I'm not saying that this is what you must do. This is what I found out after about 3 crashes in FPV and some very, very hairy moments that I don't want to go through again. So these are what I found out. So number one on that one is a deliberate short circuit. It's got nothing to do with electricity. You're not short circuiting anything. What I'm trying to say is it's basically the circuit that your aeroplane will fly A to B to C to D to A to B to C to D. You want to keep that deliberately short. You want to keep it limited. Don't try to venture out too far out. Even if your video is absolutely fine. I mean, these days a 250 milliwatt video transmitter with a decent set of antennas can give you a very good long range. So just because you're getting a good video doesn't mean you should just venture out. Keep your circuit close. Almost imagine that you're flying line of sight, but you're not. Because in line of sight, we always tend to keep our circuit short because it's only as valid as we can see. Number 2, RF range critical. This is very important. If you are starting out into FPV, just like I did about a month ago, you would have not had a UHF system, a long range RF system. So you'd be flying with one of the 2.4 gigahertz systems at hand. And these things are range critical. Now, there are sayings out there in the market that the average is about 1 kilometer, maybe more in good circumstances. And there are some makers like FR Sky which will go further than that. But when you're flying FPV, always imagine that your RF is critical in range. And as I said, if you're flying with a good video transmitter with a decent amount of power and very good antennas, there is almost a 90% chance that your video will always exceed the range of your RF. Which means while you're happy that you can see everything, you will lose your RF link, and then you will basically be a first-person viewer to your own crash. So RF range is very critical, and that's why there's an exclamation mark next to it. It's very critical. Always stay within your RF range. Some radio transmitters will give you certain beep noises when you're in and when you're close to it, when you're close to getting out of it, but stay cautious. You know, don't push the edges of it. Stay cautious, stay within your RF range, and don't go by your video range. Your video range in most cases will exceed your RF range if you're using all the normal systems. Altitude critical, that's the next one. 400 feet, that's the rule in almost a lot of countries. You cannot fly higher than this. I highly recommend that, and especially if there's any light aircraft or helicopters flying around, you cannot go higher than this. But when you're flying FPV, especially when you have no telemetry, which I will touch on in the next section, you can go quite high without even knowing. So if it feels too high, if the distance feels high, lower down the throttle and come back down. And this also works into my next point. Let's say you don't have any telemetry. The next point is sound. Now this is a very good one. If you're flying a short deliberate circuit around you, being RF range critical, then altitude can be determined with sound. If you can hear your plane and the sound is constant and it's not disappearing from you, then the plane hasn't risen in altitude. It's close by to you. The higher it goes, the less you will hear your aeroplane. In fact, staying within line of sight, you can lose the sound from your airplane depending on what kind of airplane you're using. So keep your ear open to the sound. That's a very good one. That's a very important one. And if you stop hearing your plane, then you know it's gone too far away from you. So always keep yourself within audible distance. That kind of works into all these points in here. And last one, landmark circling. We checked on landmark in the section before. It's as simple as that. If you have made 4 or 5 landmarks around you, then every time you touch one of those, you can turn and go to the next landmark. That way, it ensures that you stay within a nice and tight area and don't get yourself into trouble. So now we come down to the last point. I'll be finishing this video very soon. Thanks for sticking with me so far. Extras. Let's just say you've done all that we have just discussed and you're having a good flight. So you naturally want to go into extras. If you look into the world of FPV, there is no shortage on extras. There's loads of stuff that are basically waiting out there for that wallet in your pocket. which one should you go for? Let's just say which one you should go for if you're starting FPV. Now, if you're starting FPV, many of these things in the extra list are redundant. But the one that I've put right up top, and the one that I think is quite important, is a minimum OSD. This is not a brand mark. This is just means that an OSD, an on-screen display that shows you minimum amount of data. Nothing crowded, nothing too superimposed, just minimum amount of information, which in the order of importance would be altitude, airspeed, and battery current. Right? These three things, if you can get these three things, you will be okay. Some minimum OSDs will have a GPS with it, will roughly give you a home position. But trust me, if you follow the rules that I gave you on flight envelope and area, it's very hard to forget where you were. Unless, of course, you basically wander too far off. GPS might not be the biggest requirement, but a minimum OSD where it shows you airspeed, altitude, and battery, that's very good. Knowing altitude, as I said, for legal reasons, is a very important thing. Fly under 400 feet, don't get other people's life in risk. Number 2, airspeed. That's again another important one. If you know your airspeed roughly, you know how to control your plane. When you are out in FPV, you could very easily slow down to a point that your plane will get into a stall. So knowing your airspeed is a very good thing. Or you can remember a throttle position on your radio and tell yourself not to go underneath that in normal flying conditions. And also, as I say, yeah, we talked about airspeed sensor, altitude, and obviously your battery display. Another one that in my opinion could be very interesting, and I think it is a good one, if you have an airplane that already has a gyro in it, or if you have a gyro already laying about, a three channel gyro, or a 4-channel gyro, or 2-channel gyro, it would be a very good idea to use it on the FPV aeroplane, because what it does is, the one thing that you really need up there is stability. And the fact that there is something helping you keep straight, stopping you from wobbles, that will help you into concentrating on the other things. Things like your flight envelope and things like your area. So something that helps you keep the plane straight and you're not busy fighting the plane, that will help you concentrate on your flight more and actually enjoy it as well. Number 3, AP, Autopilot, RTH, Return to Home, acronyms that all people in FPV know. Okay, this is a big extra, and I think this should be something that you get down the line, but for your first FPV flight, maybe not. Why? Because I'm guilty of this. I flew my first FPV flight, oh no, not my first, but my third FPV flight with a full autopilot system on board, and the first time, it worked very well. The second time, it lifted the plane up all of a sudden into a steep ascent. The plane didn't have enough power. It stalled, spun around, and hit the ground face down. And that's the mini talon that I was talking about. So Autopilot and RTH, they're great things. Set up badly and not knowing what you're doing, they can absolutely crash your plane. A very, very optional and late extra for your FPV. Definitely not necessary for your first FPV flight if you keep all the other things in mind. You will already have a lot of complications and things on your mind. You don't want to make it any more complicated than that. And last one, UHF with 2 exclamation marks. Now this falls into a very, very special option category. Once you've flown FPV for a very long time and you know exactly what your aeroplane is doing, you know your setup, you know your efficiency and everything, you might want to fly further on. Let's say you take yourself to an area which is not restricted by distance or altitude, and then you want to fly a little bit further in there. UHF is a great companion. If you have one laying around, it's even a great companion for short flights because you are 100% sure that your RF signal will not be shorter than your video signal. It's always a great thing to know. But again, on the list of extras for your first or starting out an FPV flight, that is dead last, as you can see it in here. So I hope you guys learned something from this video. I know a lot of people have made videos about first FPV flights and how to get into FPV. All these things that I've just said to you are based on my own experience. And that comes from a guy that has been flying RC aeroplanes for a very long time. And I found myself in very new waters and I felt like somebody that was flying for the first time. So if this helps take any nervous edge off your first FPV flight, then that is fantastic. So if this has been any help to you guys, yeah, or if you want to do any comments or make any discussions about it, please feel free to do so. And I hope it contributes to a very enjoyable and, I can't stress enough, safe and not a very costly FPV flight. So thanks very much again for being here on Ready Set Test and watching this video. I'll catch you guys some other time. Thanks very much.